The sleek black Bentley rolled to a stop in front of the old brick apartment building. Ethan Blackwood stepped out, his tailored suit worth more than what most people in Oakwood Falls made in a year. At 35, he was already one of the richest men in the state, and definitely the most feared. How many families are still refusing to leave? Ethan asked his assistant, who hurried to keep up with his long strides. Just 3, sir. The elderly couple on the second floor, the single mother on the third, and the teacher on the fourth. Ethan's face hardened. Tell them they have until Friday. After that, we cut the utilities. As he walked through the building that would soon become his newest luxury development, Ethan felt nothing for the lives he was disrupting. Emotions were luxuries he'd abandoned long ago. His phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer confirming his latest divorce settlement was finalized. 3 marriages, 3 expensive endings. The tabloids weren't wrong when they nicknamed him the Golden Widower, though none of his ex-wives had actually died. Well, except for Vanessa. But that car accident wasn't his fault. Back in his mansion later that night, Ethan poured himself a glass of scotch and stared at the news about his latest real estate acquisition. The comments online were vicious: heartless monster, soul-sucking vampire. Does he even have feelings? He closed his laptop and walked to the large window overlooking his empty garden. For a split second, as lightning flashed, he was 15 again, hiding in his parents' bedroom closet, watching through the slats as masked men tortured his father for the combination to the safe. The strange symbol one of them had tattooed on his wrist. The screams. The blood. Ethan downed his scotch in one gulp, forcing the memory away. Across town, Madison Reynolds counted the tips from her waitressing shift and sighed. At 18, she should be excited about college, not worried about keeping her family's lights on. Her volunteer work at the local orphanage was her only escape, but even that was getting harder to maintain with her increasing work hours. "Madison, honey. Are you home?" her father William called from the living room. She found him staring at a stack of bills, his once proud shoulders now permanently stooped. A successful businessman just 2 years ago, William Reynolds had lost everything when his business partner embezzled their company funds and disappeared. "The bank called again," he said, his voice cracking. "They're moving forward with foreclosure next month." Madison sat beside him. "We'll figure something out, Dad. We always do." But her forced optimism faded when she went to find her mother's pain medication. Searching through her father's office drawer for the prescription, she discovered a hidden folder of medical records. Her hands trembled as she read the oncologist's report: aggressive cancer, spreading rapidly, experimental treatment required, survival chances without it, minimal. Madison's world tilted. Her parents had been hiding the true severity of her mother's condition. The treatments she needed weren't covered by their insurance, and they couldn't possibly afford the specialists now. In her bedroom, Madison pulled out the old photo of her grandparents. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered to their smiling images. "I promise I'll find a way to save our family. No matter what it takes." Outside, rain pounded against her window as if trying to warn her about promises too dangerous to keep. The annual charity gala at Oakwood Falls Memorial Hospital was the social event of the season. Madison had only managed to attend because the orphanage director insisted she represent them at the fundraiser. "We need every dollar we can get," Mrs. Winters had said, pressing the donated evening gown into Madison's hands. "Just smile and remind the rich folks that children are starving right in their backyard." Now Madison stood in a corner of the ballroom, feeling completely out of place among the town's elite. Her simple blue dress was elegant but nowhere near as expensive as the designer gowns surrounding her. Across the room, Ethan Blackwood entered, and the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Despite his reputation, women eyed him hungrily and men rushed to shake his hand. Power and money had that effect, Madison thought. When the orphanage director was called to speak about budget cuts, Madison found herself unexpectedly pushed to the microphone instead. "Go on," Mrs. Winters whispered. You connect with the children better than anyone. Heart pounding, Madison faced the crowd of wealthy strangers. The children at Hope House don't need luxury, she began softly. Then her voice strengthened. But they do need heat in the winter. They need books that aren't falling apart. They need to know someone cares if they succeed. As she spoke passionately about the children's needs, Madison didn't notice Ethan Blackwood watching her with unusual intensity. Something about her sincerity cut through his typical cynicism. "Who is that girl?" he asked the hospital director. "Madison Reynolds. Volunteers at the orphanage. Poor family, good heart. Her father used to be successful until that ugly business with his partner." Ethan's interest sharpened. Reynolds? William Reynolds' daughter? The next afternoon, William Reynolds was startled by a knock on his office door, a small rented space where he desperately tried to salvage what remained of his consulting business. "Mr. Blackwood would like to meet with you," said an immaculately dressed woman. "His car is waiting outside." William found himself ushered into Ethan's downtown penthouse office with its panoramic views of the city he once helped build. "I'll be direct, Mr. Reynolds," Ethan said, not bothering with pleasantries. "I know about your financial situation. I know about the foreclosure, the debts, and your wife's medical condition." William paled. "How did you dash? I make it my business to know things," Ethan interrupted. "I have a proposition for you. I'll pay off all your debts. I'll ensure your wife gets treatment from the best cancer specialists in the country. I'll even set you up with a new business opportunity." William stared in disbelief. "Why would you do that?" Ethan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I want to marry your daughter." William shot to his feet. "That's disgusting. She's 18. Your dash, offering to save your family," Ethan finished coldly. "Including your wife, who I understand has less than 6 months without the experimental treatment only available in Switzerland." William's face drained of color. "How dare you? Madison is not for sale. Everything has a price, Mr. Reynolds. You taught me that yourself, years ago." Something dark flickered across Ethan's face. "Think about it. I'll expect your call by tomorrow." Shaking with rage and shame, William left the building. But that evening, as he sat beside his sleeping wife in the hospital, the doctor's words hammered in his brain. "Without this specialized treatment, her chances are very poor, Mr. Reynolds. I wish there were other options I could offer you." William watched Eleanor's too thin chest rise and fall, her face etched with pain even in sleep. The treatment would cost over $1 million. Money they didn't have. Money no bank would lend them. Money Ethan Blackwood had offered, for the unthinkable. What kind of father would even consider such a thing, he whispered to himself, tears streaming down his face. But as the night wore on, the question slowly transformed: what kind of husband would let his wife die when he could save her? Madison knew something was wrong the moment she walked into the house. Her parents were arguing in hushed, intense voices, something they rarely did, especially with her mother's condition. "We can't even consider it, Eleanor. He's a monster. What choice do we have, William? You think I want this? But if I die dash." Madison stepped into the living room, and they immediately fell silent. Her father's face was ashen, her mother's eyes red from crying. "What's going on?" Madison asked. Her parents exchanged looks before her father sighed heavily. "Ethan Blackwood came to see me today," William began. As her father explained Ethan's proposition, Madison felt the room spin. Her own father was considering selling her to that man? The notorious, golden widower, whose previous wives had all mysteriously disappeared or died. "No!" Madison shouted, jumping to her feet. "Are you insane? I'm not some property you can trade away." "Honey, we would never force you," her mother said weakly from the couch. "But you should know all the facts." "The facts?" "The fact is he's a predator. He's twice my age and marries young women who end up dead or vanishing. Those are the facts. Madison stormed out, slamming her bedroom door. Through the thin walls, she could hear her mother crying. That night, unable to sleep, Madison opened her laptop and began researching Ethan Blackwood. News articles detailed his ruthless business practices. 3 marriages, all to young women from influential families. All ended mysteriously. 2 wives disappeared after receiving large settlements. 1 died in a car accident that was ruled suspicious but inconclusive. Madison dug deeper, finding old newspaper articles about Ethan's childhood. His parents had been murdered in their mansion when he was 15. The case was never solved. One article mentioned a strange symbol left at the crime scene, though no photo was included. By morning, Madison had created a detailed timeline of Ethan's life, relationships, and business dealings. Something wasn't adding up. How had he built his fortune so quickly after his parents' death? Why did he specifically target young women from once powerful families? And why her? Madison closed her laptop when she heard her mother's painful coughing from down the hall. She found her parents in the bathroom, her father holding her mother as she coughed blood into the sink. "We need to get you to the hospital," William said, panic in his voice. At the emergency room, Madison sat alone in the waiting area while doctors examined her mother. Desperate for answers, she searched through her father's briefcase for insurance information. Instead, she found a hidden folder with her mother's complete medical records. The prognosis was far worse than they'd told her. Without the experimental treatment, her mother had less than 3 months. The treatment had a 70% success rate, but cost over $1 million and required traveling to Switzerland. Madison felt like she couldn't breathe. When her father returned, she confronted him with the folder. "Why didn't you tell me it was this bad?" she demanded. William collapsed into the chair beside her. "We didn't want you to worry. You're so young, you should be thinking about college, not being sold to save mom's life." Madison's voice cracked. Her father winced. "I would never force you, Madison. Never. We'll find another way." "What other way, Dad?" "Your business is gone. The house is being foreclosed. We can barely afford the treatment she's getting now." Madison wiped away angry tears. "What happens when the insurance runs out next month?" That night, while her mother remained hospitalized, Madison found herself drawn back to her research on Ethan Blackwood. Something about the murder of his parents nagged at her. She located an archived police blotter that mentioned a distinctive figure-8 symbol with a crossbar found at multiple crime scenes during that period. Curious, Madison searched through her father's old business files, looking for anything that might connect him to Ethan Blackwood. In an ancient folder of contracts, she found a small figure-8 with a crossbar, stamped on documents from 20 years ago. The same symbol from the Blackwood murder scene. Madison's hands trembled as she stared at the connection between her father and the murder of Ethan Blackwood's parents. What did it mean? And did Ethan know? After 3 sleepless nights wrestling with her discovery, Madison drove to Oakwood Pines, the assisted living facility where her grandmother Claire lived. If anyone could help her make sense of this nightmare, it would be Grandma Claire, who had taught psychology at the State University for 40 years before retiring. The facility was bright and clean, but Madison couldn't ignore the faint smell of antiseptic that always made her sad. She found her grandmother sitting by the window in her small apartment, a book open on her lap. "Madison." Claire's face lit up. At 75, she still had the sharp eyes and quick mind that had guided generations of students. "What a lovely surprise." "Grandma, I need your advice," Madison said, sinking into the chair opposite her. "I'm in trouble." Over the next hour, Madison poured out everything: her mother's worsening condition, Ethan's proposal, the symbol connecting her father to the Blackwood murders, and her growing fear that there was more to this story than anyone was telling her. Claire listened without interrupting, her expression growing more troubled. When Madison finished, the older woman took her granddaughter's hands. "Sometimes the hardest choices aren't between right and wrong," Claire said quietly. "They're between impossible alternatives." "Are you saying I should marry him?" Madison asked, shocked. "I'm saying there are no perfect answers here, sweetheart. What I am saying is that you need to understand all sides of this situation before you decide." Claire stood slowly and walked to her bookshelf, pulling out an old photo album. She opened it to a black and white wedding picture herself as a young bride beside a stern-looking man. "Did I ever tell you how I met your grandfather?" Madison shook her head. "It was an arranged marriage. My father owed his father a significant debt. I was 20, studying to be a teacher, and suddenly I was told I would marry this stranger." Madison stared at the photo in disbelief. "But you and Grandpa loved each other so much." "We grew to love each other," Claire corrected. "It wasn't love at first sight. It was work, patience, and eventually understanding." She closed the album. "I'm not saying your situation is the same. Your Ethan Blackwood sounds like a troubled man with dangerous secrets." "He's not my Ethan Blackwood," Madison protested. Claire smiled sadly. "Whatever you decide, remember this. Sometimes we enter situations thinking we know who the victim is and who the villain is. Life is rarely that simple." Across town, Detective Sarah Mitchell pulled another file from the stack on her desk. At 50, Sarah had seen enough crime to know that the rich rarely faced consequences, but that hadn't stopped her from investigating Ethan Blackwood for the past 3 years. The wall of her cramped office was covered with photos of Ethan and his 3 ex-wives. Notes and timelines connected them in a complex web that so far had yielded frustrating dead ends. But Sarah couldn't let it go, not after what happened to her daughter Rachel. Rachel had fallen for a man just like Blackwood. A predator who targeted young women from vulnerable families, isolated them, and then discarded them. Rachel had taken her own life afterward. Sarah had promised her daughter's memory that she would stop other predators like him. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. "Detective Mitchell," she answered. "Sarah, it's Jim from Records. You asked us to flag anything related to Ethan Blackwood. His lawyer just filed marriage license paperwork." Sarah sat up straight. "Who's the bride?" "Madison Reynolds. 18 years old." Sarah was already grabbing her coat. "Get me everything on the Reynolds family. Now." The next day, Madison was working her shift at the local coffee shop when she accidentally spilled coffee on a customer, a serious-looking woman in her 50s. "I'm so sorry." Madison grabbed napkins to help clean up. "It's fine," the woman said, studying Madison intently. "Accidents happen." As Madison mopped up the spill, the woman introduced herself. "I'm Sarah. I'm new in town. You must be a local." "Born and raised," Madison answered, something about the woman's intense gaze making her uneasy. "I heard there's a big wedding happening soon. Some local girl marrying that billionaire, what's his name? Blackwood?" Madison's hand froze mid-wipe. "Where did you hear that?" Sarah shrugged. "People talk. I just thought it was interesting. He's quite a bit older, isn't he?" "I wouldn't know," Madison said stiffly. "Well, I'm sure the girl knows what she's doing," Sarah said, gathering her things. "Though you have to wonder about a man with his history." As Sarah left, Madison felt a chill run through her. That hadn't been a random conversation. That woman knew who she was. Back home, Madison found her mother resting on the couch, looking frilier than ever. Her latest hospitalization had depleted their remaining resources. "Mom," Madison said quietly, "tell me honestly. How much time do the doctors say you have without the treatment in Switzerland?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. 3 months. Maybe less. Madison took a deep breath. "Then I've made my decision. The Blackwood Tower downtown was imposing by design. As Madison rode the elevator to the penthouse office, her heart hammered in her chest. She had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, but facing Ethan Blackwood in person was far more intimidating than she had imagined. His assistant led her into a vast office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Ethan stood with his back to her, hands clasped behind him as he gazed out at his domain. "Miss Reynolds," he said without turning around. "I wasn't expecting you." "I want to discuss your proposal," Madison said, proud that her voice didn't shake. Now he turned, his expression unreadable. "I believe I made the proposal to your father, not to you." "I'm the one you want to marry," she replied. "So I'm the one you need to negotiate with." Something flashed in his eyes: surprise, perhaps even respect. "Very well." He gestured to a chair. "Let's negotiate." Madison remained standing. "I'll marry you on 3 conditions. First, my mother gets the full treatment in Switzerland, starting immediately. Second, all my family's debts are paid, and my father gets a fresh start. Third, I continue my volunteer work at the orphanage." Ethan studied her for a long moment. "Anything else?" Madison hadn't expected him to agree so easily. "Those are my terms." "Done." He walked to his desk and pressed a button on his phone. "Ms. Chen, prepare the paperwork we discussed for the Reynolds family. And contact Dr. Werner in Zurich. Tell him his new patient will arrive next week." Madison stared at him in shock. "Just like that?" "Just like that." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm a businessman, Miss Reynolds. You offered terms. I accepted. We have a deal." He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Madison shook it. His grip was firm, his hand unexpectedly warm. She had imagined he would feel cold to the touch. "When?" she asked. "The wedding. 3 weeks from Saturday. My event planner will handle everything." 3 weeks. Madison felt lightheaded. "May I see the paperwork for my mother's treatment? And our family's debts?" Ethan nodded. "My lawyer will deliver everything tomorrow. Including the prenuptial agreement." "Prenup?" Madison hadn't considered that. "Standard procedure." "Don't worry, it's generous. More than generous, considering the circumstances." As Madison turned to leave, Ethan spoke again. "One question, Miss Reynolds. Why did you agree?" She faced him. "For my family. Not for my money or power. Most women would have mentioned those. I'm not most women. And I don't think you're marrying me for the reasons most men marry." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of genuine curiosity. "No," he said quietly. "I'm not." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur. True to his word, Ethan arranged everything. Madison's mother was flown to Switzerland on a private jet, accompanied by specialists. Their family home was saved from foreclosure. William's debts vanished overnight. Madison barely saw Ethan during this time. He communicated through assistants and planners, as if the wedding were merely another business acquisition to manage remotely. Every night, Madison documented her thoughts and discoveries in a journal, continuing her investigation into Ethan's past and the mysterious symbol. She hid the journal in a secret compartment of the vintage jewelry box her grandmother had given her, the one possession she insisted on bringing to her new life. The night before the wedding, Madison visited her mother via video call. Eleanor looked better already, the specialized treatment beginning to work. "Are you sure about this, sweetheart?" her mother asked, worry lines creasing her face. "I'm sure," Madison lied convincingly. "It's what I want." After ending the call, Madison wrote in her journal, "Tomorrow I marry a man I believe may be connected to dark secrets in my own family's past. I don't know if he's a victim, a villain, or something in between. Maybe there's goodness in him that no one has seen yet. Maybe I can be the light in his darkness. If not, at least I saved my family. She tucked the journal into its hiding place in the jewelry box and packed it carefully in her suitcase, among the expensive new clothes Ethan had ordered for her. Madison caught her reflection in the mirror, a stranger in designer clothes, about to marry a man she barely knew and deeply mistrusted. But beneath her fear, a steely determination had formed. If Ethan Blackwood had secrets, she would uncover them. If he had demons, she would face them. And if he had any part in the tragedy that shaped both their lives, she would expose it, no matter the cost. The Blackwood estate was transformed for the wedding. Thousands of white roses adorned the mansion's grounds, and crystal chandeliers had been installed in the massive tent where 500 guests would celebrate afterward. None of them Madison's friends, just Ethan's business associates and Oakwood Falls elite, eager to witness the spectacle. "You look beautiful," William said as he prepared to walk his daughter down the aisle. His eyes were red-rimmed from crying all morning. "Dad, it's going to be okay," Madison reassured him, though she didn't believe it herself. Her wedding dress cost more than a year's rent on their old house. The diamond necklace around her throat felt like a collar. "I failed you," he whispered. "No. You didn't." Madison squeezed his hand. "Remember what matters. Mom is getting better." The wedding march began, and Madison stepped into the sunlight. The crowd rose, all eyes on her. At the end of the aisle stood Ethan, immaculate in his tuxedo. His face revealed nothing as she approached, no joy, no desire, not even triumph. Just cold assessment, like appraising a newly acquired property. The ceremony was traditional, with vows Madison had not written. When the minister prompted them to exchange rings, Ethan's assistant handed him an antique platinum band. As Ethan slipped it onto Madison's finger, she noticed something engraved inside, a small figure-8 symbol with a crossbar. The exact symbol she had found in her father's papers. The symbol supposedly left at the Blackwood murder scene. Madison nearly fainted. Her vision tunneled, and she swayed slightly. Ethan's hand gripped her elbow, steadying her. "Are you all right?" he whispered, his voice carrying concern that seemed almost genuine. Madison forced herself to nod, to breathe. She had to remain calm. This couldn't be a coincidence. He had deliberately chosen this ring, with this symbol, for her. It was a message. But what kind? "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister announced. "Mr. Blackwood, you may kiss your bride." Ethan's kiss was brief, cool, and practiced. The crowd applauded, cameras flashed, and Madison became Mrs. Blackwood, feeling more trapped than she ever had in her life. During the reception, Madison moved as if in a dream. She shook hands with strangers who kissed her cheeks and congratulated her on landing Ethan Blackwood. Women eyed her with envy and suspicion. Men looked at her with pity. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm Charlotte Winters, your husband's personal assistant," a sleek woman in her 30s said, approaching Madison at the punch table. "If you need anything at all in the coming days, please don't hesitate to ask." Madison studied the woman. Behind her professional smile, Charlotte's eyes were cold, assessing. "Thank you, Charlotte. I appreciate that," Madison replied politely. "Ethan can be demanding," Charlotte continued. His previous wives found it difficult to adjust to his expectations. The warning was clear. Charlotte wasn't an ally. "I'm sure I'll manage," Madison said. Charlotte's smile tightened. "Of course you will. For as long as it lasts." Before Madison could respond, a familiar voice called her name. "Madison. Congratulations, cousin." Parker Reynolds approached, champagne in hand. At 25, her father's nephew was the black sheep of the family, charming, unreliable, and perpetually in need of money. But right now, he was a welcome sight. "Parker." Madison embraced him gratefully. "I didn't know you were coming." "Wouldn't miss it," he said, his eyes flicking to Ethan across the room. Though I must say, your choice of husband is unexpected. He pulled her aside, lowering his voice. Are you okay? Is he forcing you somehow? I'm fine, Madison insisted. It was my choice. Parker looked unconvinced. You know what they say about his other wives. It's not like that. Then what is it like? Because last time we talked, you were applying to colleges, not planning to marry a man twice your age. Madison couldn't explain, not here. I need some air, she said instead. Parker led her to a quiet corner of the garden. For a moment, the tension in Madison's shoulders eased. Parker had always been her favorite cousin, more like a brother growing up. Remember when we snuck out to that concert last summer? He asked, smiling at the memory. You were so scared your dad would find out. Madison laughed despite herself. You told me we wouldn't get caught. And we didn't. His expression turned serious. Whatever you're caught in now, Maddie, I'm here. You know that, right? When she didn't answer, he took her hand, his thumb brushing over her new wedding ring. His eyes narrowed at the symbol inside. Where did he get this ring? Parker asked sharply. I don't know. Why? Parker dropped her hand as if burned. No reason. I should get back. Your husband is looking for you. Indeed, Ethan was scanning the crowd, his expression darkening when he spotted Madison alone with Parker. As Parker walked away, Madison felt more confused than ever. First the symbol in the ring, now Parker's strange reaction to it. What was happening? How many people knew what this symbol meant? And most importantly, what was she going to do now that she was married to a man who seemed to be sending her cryptic messages about a decades-old murder? The wedding reception continued in full swing, but tensions were rising beneath the surface. Ethan's eyes hadn't left Madison since he spotted her with Parker. He made his way through the crowd toward her, his smile fixed but his eyes cold. There you are, my dear, he said, taking her arm possessively. Our guests are waiting for us to share our first dance. As he led her to the dance floor, Madison felt the weight of hundreds of eyes watching them. Ethan pulled her close, his hand firm on her lower back. Your cousin seems very protective of you, he murmured in her ear. Parker. And I grew up together, Madison replied carefully. He's like a brother. Is that so? Ethan's grip tightened slightly. He doesn't look at you like a brother. Before Madison could respond, Parker appeared at the edge of the dance floor, his expression troubled. He caught Madison's eye and gestured subtly toward a side exit. He clearly wanted to speak with her alone. Excuse me, a voice interrupted. Charlotte appeared with a champagne flute. Mr. Blackwood, the mayor is requesting a brief word. Ethan nodded. Of course. Will you be all right for a moment, my dear? I'm fine, Madison assured him, seeing her chance to speak with Parker. As soon as Ethan walked away, Madison slipped through the crowd toward the exit Parker had indicated. She found him waiting in a small antechamber, pacing nervously. We need to talk, he said urgently. You're in danger, Maddie. What are you talking about? Parker ran a hand through his hair. That symbol in your ring, do you know what it means? No, Madison admitted. But I found it in my dad's old business papers, and it was supposedly at the scene when Ethan's parents were murdered. It's much bigger than that, Parker said, his voice dropping to a whisper. It's the mark of a secret business group that operated in this town 20 years ago. They called themselves the Infinity Circle. Your father was a member. So was Ethan's father. Madison's heart raced. What did they do? Nothing good. Money laundering, blackmail, maybe worse. Something went wrong. Most members disappeared or died mysteriously. Including Ethan's parents, Madison whispered. Yes. And now Ethan's putting their symbol on your finger. He's sending a message, Maddie. Madison's mind reeled. To who? My father? Maybe. Or maybe to whoever's left from the circle. Parker took her hands. Listen to me. You need to get out of this marriage. Now. Before the door opened suddenly. Charlotte stood there, her eyes narrowing at their joined hands. There you are, Mrs. Blackwood. Your husband is looking for you. Her tone was icy. The toast is about to begin. Madison pulled her hands from Parker's. I'll be right there. Charlotte didn't move. I'll escort you. As Madison followed Charlotte back to the reception, she glanced back at Parker. His expression was desperate, frightened. In the main hall, Ethan was waiting with 2 champagne glasses. He handed one to Madison, his eyes searching her face. Everything all right, my dear? You look pale. Just overwhelmed, Madison lied. As the best man began his toast, Madison's thoughts raced. The infinity circle. Her father and Ethan's father connected through some secret business group. The murders. The symbol now on her finger. It was all connected. While everyone was distracted by the toast, Ethan leaned close to her ear. I found your diary, Madison, he whispered, his voice chillingly calm. Quite the little investigator, aren't you? Madison froze, her glass halfway to her lips. We'll discuss it later, Ethan continued smoothly. For now, smile. Everyone's watching. Madison's hand trembled so badly she nearly dropped her glass. Ethan knew. He had found her journal with all her suspicions, all her plans. Across the room, Parker was watching them intently. He raised his glass slightly, as if in a private toast to her. His other hand touched his jacket pocket, and he nodded meaningfully at her. Madison didn't understand the message, but she felt a wave of nausea hit her. The room suddenly felt too hot, too crowded. The implications of Ethan's words sank in. He knew she had been investigating him. He knew she suspected him. And now she was legally bound to him, isolated in his world, with no way out. The best man finished his toast with a joke about Ethan's previous marriages, earning uncomfortable laughter from the crowd. To the bride and groom, he concluded. May this one last. Everyone drank. Madison raised her glass to her lips, her mind still reeling from Ethan's revelation. Something in the champagne tasted off bitter, almost metallic. She glanced at Ethan, who was watching her with an unreadable expression. Had he? No, he wouldn't poison her at their wedding, in front of hundreds of witnesses. Madison took another sip, trying to act normal. The bitter taste grew stronger, and suddenly her vision blurred. Her heart began racing unnaturally fast. The glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. Ethan, she gasped, clutching at her throat. Something's wrong. The last thing she saw before collapsing was Parker's horrified face in the crowd, and behind him, Charlotte Winters, watching with an expression that wasn't shock or concern but satisfaction. Chaos erupted in the ballroom. Madison convulsed violently on the floor, her body arching as she fought for breath. Guests screamed and backed away. Someone shouted for a doctor. Ethan knelt beside Madison, his face a mask of concern as he loosened her necklace. Call an ambulance, he ordered, his voice commanding even in crisis. Parker pushed through the crowd, dropping to his knees opposite Ethan. What did you do to her? He demanded. I didn't do anything, Ethan snapped, checking Madison's pulse. She's been poisoned. How convenient, Parker hissed, too low for others to hear. A security camera in the corner of the room silently recorded the scene, capturing the moment when genuine panic seized Ethan's features and the split second before, when his expression had shown something very different, relief. Within minutes, paramedics rushed in, but they were too late. Madison Reynolds Blackwood was pronounced dead at the scene, exactly 20 minutes after saying, I do. The ballroom emptied as police arrived. Detective Sarah Mitchell was among them, having stationed herself nearby for the wedding. She watched Ethan carefully as he answered questions, noting how controlled his responses were despite having just lost his bride. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm Detective Mitchell," she introduced herself. "I'm sorry for your loss." Ethan nodded stiffly. "Thank you, Detective. Can you think of anyone who would want to harm your wife?" "No," Ethan said. "Madison was loved by everyone. This must be a mistake. Perhaps the champagne was contaminated." Sarah noticed how he avoided eye contact. "We'll test everything, of course. Did Madison have any health conditions? Allergies?" "Not that she mentioned." His voice was perfectly steady. "And how are you feeling, Mr. Blackwood? You drank the same champagne?" Now Ethan looked directly at her, his gaze sharp. "I'm fine, Detective. I barely sipped mine before Madison collapsed." Across the room, Parker was giving his statement to another officer, his face ashen. Sarah made a note to interview him next. "Mr. Blackwood," she continued, "this is a difficult question, but I need to ask. Your previous marriages ended, unusually. Do you worry this might look suspicious?" Ethan's expression hardened. "My previous marriages have nothing to do with Madison's death, Detective. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to inform her parents." As Ethan walked away, Sarah noticed Charlotte Winters hovering nearby, her face appropriately somber but her eyes constantly tracking Ethan. Interesting. The toxicology report came back within hours rush order due to the high-profile nature of the case. Madison had been poisoned with a rare compound found in certain ancient East Asian artifacts. The poison could only be extracted through a complex chemical process, requiring specialized knowledge. Sarah reviewed the security footage from the reception. She paused the video on the frame showing Ethan's face just as Madison began to collapse, that brief moment of what looked like relief before panic took over. She tapped her pen against her desk. Why would a man be relieved at his new bride's collapse, unless he expected it? The next day, Ethan emerged from his mansion to make a brief statement to the press. His eyes were red-rimmed, his voice hoarse as he spoke of his shock and devastation. The reporters ate up the tragic billionaire widower, cursed with loss yet again. But alone in his study that night, with the cameras gone and the mansion empty, Ethan's demeanor changed completely. He poured himself a large scotch and stared at Madison's diary, which he'd found in her luggage the night before the wedding. The pages detailed her investigation into him, her suspicions about his connection to her father, and her discovery of the symbol, the mark of the infinity circle. She'd gotten dangerously close to the truth. Ethan hadn't killed her. He didn't need to. He'd discovered she was pregnant from the diary, a child that couldn't possibly be his, since he'd been sterile since a teenage accident. She'd planned to take his money and run with her cousin Parker, the baby's father. The diary spelled it all out. When she collapsed at the reception, his first reaction had been relief she couldn't expose what she knew about the infinity circle or the murders of his parents. But he hadn't poisoned her. Someone else had beaten him to it. The security team delivered the rest of the camera footage. Ethan fast-forwarded through the reception until he found what he was looking for: Charlotte, slipping something into a champagne glass while the staff were distracted. The glass that ended up in Madison's hand. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Charlotte had been with him for 10 years, managing his life with terrifying efficiency. He'd never suspected her feelings ran deeper than professional loyalty. Now he had a problem. Charlotte knew too much about his business, his past, his secrets. And she'd just committed murder at his wedding. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His head of security entered. "Sir, the police are here with a warrant. They're seizing all security footage and your personal electronic devices." Ethan's mind raced. The footage of Charlotte would clear him, but it would raise questions about why she would kill Madison. Questions that might lead back to the infinity circle, to his parents' murder, to secrets buried for 20 years. Let them in, Ethan decided. Sometimes the best defense was to appear cooperative. As Detective Sarah Mitchell entered his study, Ethan knew that his carefully constructed life was about to unravel. The question was how much he could salvage and who he would sacrifice to save himself. Have you ever witnessed a moment that changed everything? Share in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe to see how this shocking story unfolds. Madison's funeral was a media spectacle. News vans lined the cemetery gates as Oakwood Falls elite gathered to witness the latest chapter in what tabloids were calling the Blackwood Curse. Ethan stood stoic and alone by the grave, his face appropriately grim beneath dark sunglasses. Detective Sarah Mitchell observed from a distance, noting who attended and who didn't. Charlotte Winters was conspicuously absent, having called in sick the day after the wedding and disappeared shortly after. William Reynolds could barely stand, supported by friends as he faced his daughter's casket. The news of Madison's death had reached her mother in Switzerland, whose condition had deteriorated upon hearing it. The experimental treatment would continue. Ethan had ensured that, but Eleanor Reynolds now fought with diminished will to live. After the service, Sarah approached Ethan as mourners dispersed. "Mr. Blackwood, we need to discuss the autopsy results." Ethan nodded curtly. "My office." 1 hour. When Sarah arrived at Blackwood Tower, she was escorted directly to Ethan's office. He sat behind his massive desk, looking more tired than she'd ever seen him. The autopsy confirmed poison, Sarah began without preamble. A rare toxin found in certain ancient Chinese artifacts. Specifically, ceremonial daggers from the Ming dynasty. Ethan's expression remained neutral. And you're a known collector of such artifacts, Mr. Blackwood." "I'm a collector of many things, detective. That doesn't make me a poisoner." Sarah placed a folder on his desk. "Madison was pregnant, Mr. Blackwood. 2 months along." This information clearly wasn't news to Ethan, but he feigned surprise well. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Sarah asked pointedly. Ethan met her gaze. "Yes. I've been sterile since I was 19. Car accident. Check my medical records." Sarah had already verified this fact, but wanted to see his reaction. "Then who was the father?" "I have a theory," Ethan said coldly. Her cousin Parker seemed unusually concerned about her at the wedding. "We're testing DNA samples now," Sarah confirmed. "But here's what puzzles me, Mr. Blackwood. If the baby wasn't yours, and you knew that, you'd have a strong motive to want Madison gone. If I wanted Madison gone, detective, I wouldn't have married her in the first place." Sarah changed tactics. "We found Madison's diary." Ethan tensed slightly, the first genuine reaction she'd seen from him. "She was investigating you," Sarah continued. "She believed you were connected to her father through something called the Infinity Circle, and that this group was linked to your parents' murder." Madison had an active imagination, Ethan dismissed. "Understandable, given the circumstances of our marriage." "The symbol in her wedding ring," Sarah pressed. "Figure 8 with a crossbar. What does it mean?" "It's a family crest. Nothing more." Sarah knew he was lying. "We're analyzing security footage from the reception. Several cameras had clear views of the champagne table." "Good," Ethan said firmly. "Then you'll find who really poisoned my wife." After Sarah left, Ethan called his head of security. "What's our status?" "We've wiped most of the footage showing Charlotte with the champagne," the man reported. "But Detective Mitchell's team already has copies of everything." Ethan cursed under his breath. He'd underestimated Sarah Mitchell. She was connecting dots faster than he'd anticipated. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan returned to his office and opened his safe. Inside was a file he hadn't touched in 20 years. The original police report on his parents' murder, obtained through bribes and threats. The report contained details never released to the public, the symbol left carved into his father's desk, the missing ledger, the strange connection to William Reynolds. The truth about the Infinity Circle. Ethan had spent years piecing together what happened that night. The Circle had been a group of Oakwood Falls' most powerful men, engaged in everything from insider trading to blackmail. His father had been their leader until he threatened to expose them all. William Reynolds had been the youngest member, brought in to handle their technology needs. Madison had stumbled onto the truth through her father's old papers. Ethan had married her partly to control what she knew, partly to flush out whoever else might be connected to his parents' killers. He hadn't expected her to die, at least not so publicly, so soon. Now he had a dead bride, a missing assistant who had committed murder, and a determined detective uncovering secrets he'd buried for decades. The phone rang, startling him. Unknown number. Blackwood, he answered. You should have left it alone, Ethan. The voice was electronically disguised. The Circle was disbanded for a reason. Ethan's grip tightened on the receiver. Who is this? Someone who knows what really happened to your parents. And to Madison. Charlotte acted alone, Ethan said firmly. Did she? Check your private email. See what Madison was really investigating. The line went dead. Ethan immediately checked his secure email account. A new message contained a single video attachment. The video showed Madison meeting with Parker Reynolds a week before the wedding. They were in a hotel room, clearly intimate. Once we have his money, Parker was saying, we disappear. Start fresh somewhere else. Madison looked uncertain. What about my parents? They'll be taken care of. The Swiss doctors are already paid for a year. Madison nodded slowly. And the Infinity Circle? What my dad did? Leave it buried, Parker warned. Those people killed Ethan's parents. They won't hesitate to kill anyone who threatens them. The video ended. Ethan sat back, mind racing. Madison and Parker had planned to take his money and run. But more importantly, Parker knew about the Infinity Circle. He knew about Ethan's parents' murder. Which meant William Reynolds had shared information with his nephew. How many others knew? Ethan's phone buzzed with a text from his security team, Detective Mitchell requesting another meeting. Says it's urgent. The walls were closing in. Ethan had to make a choice, continue trying to cover up the past, or use what he knew to find his parents' killers once and for all. Either way, he needed to find Charlotte Winters before the police did. She was the key to everything and the only person who could confirm whether he had genuinely looked relieved when Madison collapsed. The evidence against Ethan mounted quickly. Within days of Madison's funeral, Detective Sarah Mitchell obtained a warrant for his arrest. The media frenzy was immediate. Cameras captured every moment as Ethan Blackwood, in handcuffs, was led from Blackwood Tower to a waiting police car. Ethan Blackwood, you're under arrest for the murder of Madison Reynolds Blackwood, Sarah announced, loud enough for the reporters to hear. I didn't kill her, Ethan said evenly, his face a mask of control even as his world collapsed around him. The holding cell was cold and bare, a shocking contrast to the luxury Ethan was accustomed to. As he sat on the hard bench, the reality of his situation sank in. His lawyer had been blunt, the circumstantial evidence was damning. The poison came from his collection. Madison's diary detailed her fear of him. The security footage showing Charlotte tampering with the champagne had mysteriously been altered, making it inadmissible. When Sarah Mitchell came to interview him, Ethan was sleep-deprived and disheveled. You look terrible, she observed, sitting across from him. Prison doesn't suit me, Ethan replied dryly. Sarah opened her folder. Let's talk about Charlotte Winters. If you find her, I'd like to talk to her myself. We found her car abandoned at a bus station. Looks like she fled, Sarah said. Convenient for you. How is that convenient? Ethan asked. She's the one who poisoned Madison. So you say. But why would your loyal assistant of 10 years suddenly murder your new bride? Ethan hesitated. The truth would open doors he'd kept locked for decades. But he was running out of options. Charlotte was in love with me, he finally said. Had been for years. She saw Madison as a threat. Sarah studied him. That's your defense? The jealous assistant did it? It's the truth. Here's another truth, Sarah countered. My daughter killed herself 5 years ago after being manipulated and used by a man just like you. A predator who targeted vulnerable young women from struggling families. Ethan's eyes widened slightly. This wasn't a normal police interview. Your company, Blackwood Investments, ran the hedge fund that scammed her and hundreds of others, Sarah continued, her voice tight with controlled rage. She lost everything, including her will to live. I'm sorry about your daughter, Ethan said carefully. But I didn't kill Madison. Sarah leaned forward. I've been watching you for years, Blackwood. 3 wives, all young, all from families with secrets. Now Madison investigating the Infinity Circle, pregnant with another man's child. The perfect storm of motives. If you've been investigating me, then you know I couldn't have children, Ethan argued. Why would I kill her for being pregnant with another man's baby when I could simply divorce her? Sarah didn't answer directly. The poison used on Madison came from a dagger in your private collection. A dagger that's now missing. Someone took it, Ethan insisted. Charlotte had access to my collections. She knew about my condition. She saw Madison with Parker at the wedding. Parker Reynolds, Sarah nodded. Yes, DNA confirmed he was the baby's father. We've questioned him extensively. Ethan leaned forward. And? He claims Madison was going to leave you after securing funds for her mother's treatment. Says they were in love. They were conspiring to defraud me, Ethan corrected. Check Madison's emails. Parker's bank accounts. Sarah's expression remained impassive. Sleep deprivation makes people see things that aren't there, Mr. Blackwood. It also makes them more likely to confess to things they did. I'm not confessing to anything, Ethan said firmly. Because I didn't kill Madison. After Sarah left, Ethan paced his cell. The walls seemed to close in as memories of his parents' murder flooded back the closet where he'd hidden, watching through the slats as masked men tortured his father, demanding something called the ledger. The nightmares came when he finally collapsed from exhaustion. In his dreams, Madison's face morphed into his mother's, both women screaming for help he couldn't provide. Days turned into weeks. Ethan's empire began crumbling as investors fled and the board of directors distanced themselves. His lawyer brought increasingly bad news with each visit, former business associates turning against him, evidence of financial misconduct being uncovered, the prosecutor building a case that could put him away for life. In his darkest moment, alone in his cell at 3 a.m., Ethan made a decision. He needed to tell Sarah Mitchell everything about the Infinity Circle, his parents' murder, William Reynolds' involvement, and his suspicions about who might have orchestrated Madison's death. The next morning, he requested a meeting with her. I'm ready to talk, he told her when she arrived. Not about Madison's murder, I didn't do it. But about everything else. Sarah regarded him skeptically. Why now? Because someone is eliminating everyone connected to the Infinity Circle. My parents were first. Now Madison. I might be next, or you might, if you keep investigating. Sarah's expression didn't change, but Ethan could see he'd caught her interest. 20 years ago, he began, a group of Oakwood Falls' most powerful men formed a secret society. They called themselves the Infinity Circle. My father was their leader. William Reynolds was their tech expert. They were involved in everything from insider trading to blackmail. As Ethan revealed the truth he'd protected for decades, Sarah took careful notes. He explained how his father had wanted out, threatened to expose the others, and was murdered for it. How he'd spent years tracking down former members, only to find most dead or disappeared. How he discovered William Reynolds had been present the night of the murder but claimed to have been forced to participate. "That's why I married Madison," Ethan admitted. "To get closer to William. To find out what he knew." When he finished, Sarah sat back. "That's quite a story. But it doesn't explain the security footage showing your relief when Madison collapsed." Ethan met her gaze. "I wasn't relieved she was dying. I was relieved because seconds before she collapsed, she whispered something to me, 'I know you didn't kill them.' She meant my parents." Sarah Mitchell stared at the evidence board in her office, photos and documents connected by red string creating a complex web of relationships. At the center were two photos, Ethan Blackwood and Madison Reynolds. Surrounding them were the players in this twisted drama: Charlotte Winters, Parker Reynolds, William Reynolds, and the shadowy figures of the Infinity Circle. After 3 months of investigation, the truth had finally emerged. Charlotte Winters had been located in Canada and extradited back to face charges. Her confession was surprising yet made perfect sense. She had poisoned Madison after discovering her pregnancy and planned escape with Parker. Charlotte's obsession with Ethan had driven her to eliminate the threat, believing she was protecting him. More shocking was the DNA test that confirmed Parker Reynolds was the baby's father and that Parker himself was the son of one of the original Infinity Circle members. The connection had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. When the judge announced Ethan's release, the courtroom erupted. The evidence against Charlotte was overwhelming: security footage recovered from a backup system, her fingerprints on the poison vial, and her own detailed confession. Ethan walked out of the courthouse a free man legally, but his life had been irrevocably changed. The investigation into Madison's death had exposed Ethan's questionable business practices. The SEC launched probes into Blackwood Enterprises. Investors fled. The board forced him out of his own company. His reputation, already tarnished, was now destroyed. Ethan returned to his mansion to find it empty, staff gone, possessions seized for the investigation. He wandered through the silent rooms like a ghost, finally ending up in his study with a bottle of scotch. As he poured a glass, he noticed a small package on his desk that hadn't been there before. Inside was a thumb drive and a note, the complete Infinity Circle ledger. Madison found it before she died. Use it wisely. William Reynolds had kept the ledger all these years, the document Ethan's father had died protecting. The very evidence that could expose every member of the Infinity Circle still alive. That night, Ethan read through the files, horrified by the extent of the Circle's activities and the prominent names involved. Judges. Politicians. Business leaders. Some still in power today. A knock at the door interrupted his reading. Detective Sarah Mitchell stood outside, no longer in her official capacity. "I figured you'd be drinking," she said, inviting herself in. "Mind sharing?" Ethan poured her a glass. "Come to gloat?" "I came to talk about the Infinity Circle," Sarah replied. "And about what happens next." "What happens next is I rebuild my life," Ethan said bitterly. Sarah laughed without humor. "Your life as you knew it is over, Blackwood. Your company's tanking. Your reputation is shot. The only thing you have left is the truth about the Circle." Ethan glanced at the thumb drive. "How did you know?" "William Reynolds told me before he left town. He's been a confidential informant for months." Ethan absorbed this betrayal silently. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah continued. "You're going to use that information to bring down the remaining members of the Circle, the ones who ordered your parents killed, the ones who've been protected for decades while others took the fall." "Why would I do that?" "Because it's the only way you'll ever find peace," Sarah said simply. "And because if you don't, I'll make sure the world knows exactly how you built your fortune on the backs of vulnerable people like my daughter." In that moment, Ethan saw Sarah clearly for the first time, not just as a detective pursuing justice, but as a mother seeking redemption for her daughter's death. They were more alike than he'd realized. Your company's investment scam that targeted my Rachel, Sarah said, her voice catching. I traced it back to policies you personally approved. Ethan felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. I didn't know the specifics of every investment strategy. That's not good enough anymore, Sarah countered. People died because of decisions made in your name, while you looked the other way. The truth hit Ethan like a physical blow. He had become what he hated, someone who profited from others' pain, just like the men who destroyed his family. What do you want from me? He asked quietly. Justice, Sarah answered. Not just for Madison or my daughter, but for everyone hurt by the circle and by your company. In the weeks that followed, Ethan worked with Sarah to build cases against the surviving Infinity Circle members. Using the ledger and his own resources, they created an anonymous tip line for victims of financial crimes to come forward. The first domino fell when a federal judge was arrested for bribery. Evidence provided anonymously led investigators straight to offshore accounts linked to the circle. More arrests followed. With each one, Ethan felt a piece of his parents' legacy being reclaimed. His own legal troubles mounted as investigations into Blackwood Enterprises revealed years of questionable practices. Ethan did not fight the charges. Instead, he liquidated his remaining assets and established a foundation to repay victims of financial fraud. When reporters asked why a man once known for ruthless business tactics would give away his fortune, Ethan had no public answer. But privately, he thought of Madison, how she had discovered the truth and, in her final moments, absolved him of his parents' death. She had seen something in him worth saving. 6 months after Madison's death, Ethan stood at her grave with a single white rose. The media had long since moved on to newer scandals. His former social circle had abandoned him. His empire was dismantled. Yet for the first time since his parents' murder, Ethan felt something like peace. You were right, he said to Madison's headstone. I didn't kill them. But I've been dead inside ever since. Maybe now I can start to live again. As he placed the rose on her grave, Ethan noticed a figure watching from a distance, Sarah Mitchell, who had become an unlikely ally in his journey toward redemption. 5 years had passed since Madison Reynolds died 20 minutes after becoming Madison Blackwood. Oakwood Falls had largely forgotten the scandal, distracted by newer dramas and crises. But the town had not forgotten Ethan Blackwood. They had simply come to see him differently. The imposing Blackwood Tower downtown had been renamed Hope Center, now housing nonprofit organizations that provided legal aid, financial counseling, and support for victims of domestic abuse. The man who once evicted families for profit now provided affordable housing for those in need. Ethan himself was barely recognizable from the cold, calculating businessman of years past. His designer suits had given way to casual attire, his commanding presence softened by humility. He worked anonymously most days, avoiding attention as he helped run the foundation that bore Madison's name. Mr. Blackwood? A young couple hesitated in the doorway of his modest office. We were told you could help us. Ethan gestured for them to sit. Just Ethan, please. Tell me your situation. Their story was painfully familiar: predatory loans, mounting debt, the threat of losing their home and business. The same tactics Ethan had once employed or ignored. I think we can help, he told them after listening carefully. The foundation can restructure your debt and provide legal assistance with the loan company. Why would you do that for strangers? The husband asked suspiciously. Ethan smiled slightly. Because someone once helped me see that wealth without compassion is meaningless. Later that day, Sarah Mitchell arrived at Ethan's office. At 55, she had retired from the police force but continued working with the foundation, using her investigative skills to identify financial predators. The Carson case is moving forward, she reported. The prosecutor thinks we have enough to bring charges against the entire lending group. Good, Ethan nodded. Any word from William Reynolds? Sarah shook her head. Still in Switzerland with Eleanor. Her treatments are working. Doctor says she's in remission. Ethan absorbed this news quietly. After Madison's death, he had continued funding Eleanor's medical care, though the Reynolds family wanted nothing to do with him personally. William had eventually shared everything he knew about the Infinity Circle before relocating permanently to be with his wife. "It's raining," Sarah observed, looking out the window. "Are you still planning to go?" "Yes," Ethan replied. "Will you come this time?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "I think I'm ready." They drove in silence to the cemetery where Madison was buried. The rain fell steadily as they approached her grave with white roses in hand. "5 years," Ethan murmured, kneeling in the mud. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday." Sarah stood respectfully back, watching as Ethan placed his rose on the headstone. For years, she had seen him make this pilgrimage, witnessing his transformation from a man she despised to someone she reluctantly respected. "My foundation helped its 1,000th family this week," Ethan said to the grave. "People like your parents, facing impossible choices. I wish you could see it." As they turned to leave, they spotted a young man approaching Madison's younger brother Jason, now 23 and a law student at the state university. He was a scholarship recipient through Madison's foundation, though he had initially rejected any help from Ethan. "I thought I might find you here today," Jason said, his expression solemn but not hostile. "Jason," Ethan acknowledged him with surprise. "How are your studies going?" "Good. I'm focusing on financial crimes prosecution." He placed his own flower beside Ethan's. "My sister would have liked that." The three stood in silence for a moment before Jason spoke again. "My parents are back in town. They want to see you." Ethan's shock must have shown on his face. "Mom's cancer is in remission," Jason explained. "She says she's ready to face the past before she can truly move forward." That evening, Ethan found himself sitting in the Reynolds' living room, the weight of unspoken grief hanging in the air. Eleanor was frail but clear-eyed. William could barely meet Ethan's gaze. "I don't expect forgiveness," Ethan said after an uncomfortable silence. "I just want you to know that Madison changed me. Her death his voice caught, forced me to see what I'd become." Eleanor reached for his hand, surprising everyone. "We've been watching what you've done with the foundation. Using your money to help people like us. It doesn't bring Madison back," Ethan acknowledged. "No," William spoke finally. "But it honors who she was. Her compassion. Her belief that people could change." When Ethan left the Reynolds home, something had shifted. Not forgiveness, exactly, but recognition. Acknowledgement of his humanity and his genuine transformation. The next day, Ethan stood before a room full of people at the Hope Center's annual fundraiser. As he prepared to speak, he saw faces that represented his journey: Sarah Mitchell, Jason Reynolds, families helped by the foundation, former victims of the Infinity Circle, even staff from the orphanage where Madison had volunteered. 20 minutes, Ethan began. "That's how long Madison Reynolds was my wife before she was taken from us. 20 minutes that changed everything." The room fell silent. "In 20 minutes, I lost a wife I barely knew. But in the 5 years since, I found a humanity I never knew existed inside me. Some would say I don't deserve this second chance, and perhaps they're right. But each life we help rebuild is a tribute to Madison, whose brief presence in my life altered its course forever." Ethan paused, looking out at the gathering. "We can't change our past. But we can choose what we do with our future. That's the greatest lesson Madison taught me, and it's the gift I hope to pass on to everyone who comes through our doors." As applause filled the room, Ethan caught Sarah's eye. They had traveled an unlikely path from enemies to allies, bound by loss and a shared commitment to justice. Not friends, exactly, but companions in the difficult work of redemption. Outside, the rain had stopped. A new day was beginning in Oakwood Falls. We've almost reached the end of this emotional journey of redemption and transformation. Thank you for following every moment of this story. Which part touched your heart the most? Leave a comment below, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to believe that genuine change is possible, even after the most serious mistakes.